This is one of a handful of lectures, a very small number, that I'm presenting to you that's basically right out of the textbook. And you might say, why do I need to watch this lecture since I can read? In fact, I'm required to read the textbook. Well, that's because, as John Bunyan put it, there are some things that need to go in both through the eye gate, that's your reading, and the ear gate. And so some of these things are so important that I want to make sure you not only read them, but that you hear them. And furthermore, in speaking from the material in the book, I have the freedom to elaborate and say some things not in the book and so forth. So there will be times here that I may say, I'll leave the rest of this for the textbook. But we are talking today about everybody's favorite subject, fasting. Why would we ever want to miss a meal? Well, it's for the purpose of godliness. Let's keep that in mind. That's why every chapter has that subtitle that takes us back to the first chapter, Discipline Yourself for the Purpose of Godliness. So every chapter heading, whatever the topic is, whether it's journaling, whether it's serving, whether it's prayer, it's for the purpose of godliness. So, thus we look at this subject of fasting. And when you think of people who fast, does Jesus come to mind? I hope you don't think only of rugged John the Baptist types and people who are kind of hollow-eyed and odd for God sort of people. This is something, as we'll see, should be a part of normal, healthy Christianity. But fasting is yet, I think, the most feared and misunderstood of all the spiritual disciplines. It's the most feared because we actually feel this one in our bodies, and the feeling is uncomfortable. No one likes to feel hungry. We acknowledge that. And no one wants to feel unpleasant feelings and to do so voluntarily. We don't want to be considered weird in any way. So this is the most feared, I think, of the disciplines, mainly because of the discomfort that we know we will endure when we fast. But it's also the most misunderstood. And as with anything biblical, it's because there's a famine of teaching. We can't expect people to do what they've never been taught to do. You can't expect people to be Christian financial stewards, biblical financial stewards, if they've never been taught biblical financial stewardship. In like manner, we can't expect people to practice fasting if they've never been taught fasting. Well, why haven't people been taught fasting? Well, in one sense, it can reflect a general departure from the Bible in terms of preaching and teaching in a local church. But even in churches where the Bible is regularly preached and taught and believed, it's hard for someone in front of a classroom or especially in the pulpit to be a vigorous advocate of something they don't practice. It's hard to stand and urge other people to fast for the purpose of godliness if they themselves do not fast. So it's generally misunderstood. I think people know it's in the Bible. In fact, it's mentioned more often in the Bible than something as important as baptism. By my count, there are some 77 references in the Bible to fasting and 75 to baptism. So we don't want to overlook anything that's taught so frequently in the Bible. But how much have you heard about fasting? How many sermons have you heard? How many lessons have been taught? How much have you read? There's just not a great deal out there. And so I don't have another survey of the Bible on fasting. I just have the one that's in the textbook. And I think it's important to talk about it in class. And so since I don't have another or better survey of fasting, I'm presenting the one that I have presented in the textbook with some additions. There has been a renewal of fasting, however, in recent times in the church, I think in large part because there's been in the last few decades, in the Southern Baptist Convention at least, through the conservative resurgence, there's been a more widespread return to the Bible in our churches, and the return to the Bible means a renewed emphasis on things taught in the Bible. And so there have been, for example, in the mid-90s, the late Bill Bright had a couple of national conferences on fasting, encouraging people to engage in 40-day fasts. Now, typically, they involved people still eating fruit or drinking fruit juice, but nevertheless, some sense of fasting was emphasized. One of the recent presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention wrote a book on fasting, and I can think of at least one other that had some success and prominence. So there has been, at least in the 90s, early 2000s, there has been a spate of books and conferences and things on fasting, and so it's not quite as in the background today as it used to be. One writer on the spiritual disciplines made the claim that there was only one book from an evangelical perspective on fasting written in the entire first half of the 20th century. I can't confirm that, but I'm pretty sure there weren't very many. So think about that. The entire first half of the 20th century, one small book, I'll quote from in a little bit, one small book on a subject mentioned 77 times in the Bible. And as I said, it's very likely you've never heard teaching on it before. So don't think that this is unimportant. Don't think that this is a minor issue, an unbiblical issue, simply because in your experience it's been minimized. I would contend that our experience perhaps doesn't match that of Scripture. So we shouldn't ignore the blessings that are presented to us in fasting. God gives us fasting for our good and for His glory. And there are blessings that are unique to fasting. If we could get the same blessings through prayer that we get through fasting, fasting would be irrelevant. It wouldn't be in the Bible. We wouldn't need it. But there are blessings that will come to us only as we engage in this particular spiritual discipline. Now, let me say at the outset, it should be clear in your syllabus, but I want to reiterate it, and I will do so again at the end, that in your assignment and in your own ministry as you're teaching on the subject, we are not calling people to do anything that would put themselves at risk, their health at risk, their unborn child certainly at risk. So don't misunderstand any of the class requirements or any of the teaching here as calling upon you to do anything that would put your health or your safety or that of your child in any sort of danger or risk. We don't want to do that. I'll say more about that a little later on. So let's begin by an explanation of what we mean by fasting. It is a Christian's voluntary abstinence from food for spiritual purposes. It's for believers in Christ, because fasting done by those who don't have a relationship with Jesus is going to gain no benefit for them, and we practice this as a believer with a desire to be more like Christ. And so we want to do this according to the biblical teaching on the subject. It's voluntary, and that fasting should never be coerced, and it's more than just the ultimate crash diet for the body. It's to be engaged in for spiritual purposes. Now, that's not to say it's wrong to fast to lose weight or to cleanse the body of toxins. Those are good things. But the kind of fasting spoken of in the Bible and in the textbook and in these lectures is the kind of fast that's done for spiritual purposes, intimacy with Christ, conformity to Christ. Now, there is a broader definition of fasting that's spoken of frequently in Christian literature on the subject and affirmed by people as diverse as Richard Foster on the left and Martin Lloyd-Jones on the right, where fasting is spoken of as abstaining from any legitimate freedom. So, for example, abstaining from the internet or from the television. These things are not sinful in and of themselves, these practices. But sometimes a person may refer to fasting from them because they believe that these things have gotten too great a hold on their time or too great a hold on their heart. And so to recover mastery over those things and to minimize their dominance, they will abstain from the internet or from the television for a while and refer to this as fasting. And I affirm all of that. It's just that in this lecture and in the textbook, I'm referring only to fasting from food, and that's because that's the way the Bible always speaks of it. So I think there is a fasting principle we can apply to other items in life, and all the things that we're teaching here in this textbook and in this lecture would apply. But strictly speaking, I'm going to hold my comments to fasting from food because that's the way the Bible addresses the subject. Now, let me distinguish, as the Bible does, I think, between different kinds of fasts. The Bible does not use these terms, but I think we can identify them in Scripture And so one would be what we'll call a normal fast. A normal fast is abstaining from all food but not liquids. At least you would drink water during your fast. And this we call a normal fast. In Matthew 4, verse 2, it reports of Jesus, after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. It doesn't say that he was thirsty. Furthermore, in Luke 4, verse 2, describing the same 40-day temptation episode, it says he ate nothing during those days. It doesn't say he drank nothing during those days. Now, as we'll see in a little bit, I think there is some reason to believe he also did not drink anything. But the Bible doesn't say that. In both references, it says he became hungry, and say he became thirsty. He ate nothing. It does say he didn't drink anything. Now, if you've ever been to the place where we're told this occurred, you know there's not much water there. And so I think there's a reason to believe, and I'll explain this in a moment, why this may have been what we call a supernatural fast, that not only did he abstain from eating for 40 days, he abstained from drinking. But strictly speaking, the Bible doesn't say that. So we refer to this as a normal fast where you abstain from food but not water. And this is perhaps the most common kind of Christian fast, so we call it a normal fast. Next, we would refer to a partial fast. And a partial fast is where you limit the diet, but you don't abstain from all food or drink. So for 10 days, the biblical example here is in Daniel 1:12. For 10 days, Daniel and 3 other Jewish young men says they had only vegetables to eat and water to drink. So a limited diet. They were offered things from the king's table, the meats and the other things, but they limited themselves just to eating vegetables and water. The rugged prophet John the Baptist is known for at least part of his life. His diet consisted only of locusts and wild honey, which is a pretty limited diet, I would affirm. And historically, Christians have observed partial fasts in the way I'm about to describe. And this is very important, especially in ministry and as it relates even to this class. I have students every single semester who will say to me, I can't participate in a normal fast because I get migraines if I don't eat at regular intervals, or I am diabetic and will have problems if I don't eat at regular intervals, or I'm pregnant and I need to have more consistent diet. So that's true in every semester. And if you teach on fasting in your church context, this is important to know also because you will have people like that certainly who will be hearing you teach on this subject. So by means of a partial fast, I think where there's a will, there's a way. In the, I guess now thousands of students I have taught in the seminary on this subject, I've only had one who could not participate by means of a partial fast. And frankly, I think that student could have, but I didn't want to press it. So by means of a partial fast, one can fast in the way that I'm about to describe. You eat much smaller portions if you need a balanced diet, but much smaller portions than normal, or you eat one simple food like just bread, just rice. And you get the minimal nutritional intake that you need to keep you from getting a migraine, having diabetic issues, or issues with your pregnancy. So you do eat, but you limit what you eat so that preferably you still feel some hunger, or you certainly don't get the pleasure of eating by eating something just bland, just rice, just bread. Whatever it is, it will give you the minimal nutritional intake that your situation requires. For we'll see soon the importance of hunger. Hunger is your friend in fasting. Hunger serves your greater purpose. Fasting, as we'll emphasize over and over, is not an endurance contest where you just simply think, how much longer till this is over? Your hunger actually serves you and helps you in regard to fasting. So even those who cannot have a normal fast almost always can participate by means of a partial fast. And for almost all of us, our flesh rages against this idea of not eating. And so all of us, I think our flesh tends to look for excuses why we can't participate. We look for a loophole. Well, by means of a partial fast, just about everybody can fast. A third kind of fast in the Bible we might call an absolute fast. That's nothing by mouth. With a normal fast, you abstain from food, but you still have water, perhaps coffee, fruit juice to keep your blood sugar level up. but in an absolute fast, nothing by mouth. We see this illustrated in Ezra. We're told in Ezra 10, verse 6, Ezra withdrew, neither eating bread nor drinking water, for he was mourning over the faithlessness of the exiles. When Esther requested that all the Jews fast and pray on her behalf, she said in Esther 4:16, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa," that was the name of the capital, "and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day." And when Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul, was converted on the road to Damascus, Acts 9:9 tells us, for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. A fourth category would be what we would call a supernatural fast. This requires God's specific call and miraculous intervention into the bodily processes. So when Moses was to meet with God on Mount Sinai, he said in Deuteronomy 9:9, "I remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. I neither ate bread nor drank water." You can't go 40 days without water. You can go 40 days without food, but you can't go 40 days without water. And so God intervened and God just sustained him. God was all he needed. God's presence and power sustained every need that Moses had. Then 1 Kings 19 verse 8 may be saying that Elijah did the same thing at the same place. When he went to the site of Moses' miraculous fast, we're told there, he arose and ate and drank, and so this is after he was miraculously fed by the ravens, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God, which is another name for Mount Sinai. So it appears that he was there and either en route, and while after arrival there, he went 40 days and 40 nights without food or water. And that's why I think it may be that the fast of Jesus and his 40-day temptation may have been a supernatural fast. Because in the Old Testament, you have the great lawgiver, Moses, the great prophet, Elijah, both of whom appear to have had supernatural fasts of 40 days. It makes sense then that the one to whom they would ultimately point, Jesus, would have a 40-day fast. If he had a 40-day fast, it likewise would be supernatural. But again, we're reading into that. The Bible only says of Jesus that he ate nothing during those days. Then we change and talk about a private fast. This is the one referred to most often in this book and in these lectures on fasting, where Jesus said in Matthew 6:16-18 that we should not fast in a way to be noticed by others, so it's in private. But the Bible also refers to congregational fasts, where an entire church, group of people are called to fast, in which case, as we'll see later, I think it's fair to discuss it with those who are participating. How is your fast going? But we'll say more about that in a bit. In Joel chapter 2, verses 15-16, it says, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast. Call a solemn assembly, gather the people, consecrate the congregation." So all the congregation, all the people were to fast. At least part of the congregation of the church at Antioch was fasting together in Acts 13:2, as evidenced by Luke's words there, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting. That's where the Lord said, "Set apart from me Barnabas and Saul." So at least part of the church, if not all the church, was fasting. In research I've done on Jonathan Edwards, it's very evident they commonly had fast days that were called by the church or even by the city government, and in some cases the whole Massachusetts colonial government. There would be a colony-wide fast or a city-wide fast in Northampton. And these were often like on Thursdays, for example, and they had them fairly regularly. So the whole congregation, the whole town, everyone in the colony was called to fast. Charles Spurgeon preached one of his most famous sermons to the largest group he ever preached to during a national day of humiliation and fasting in England. Then we can speak of national fasts in the sense of in the Old Covenant, where every year, the national fast in response to an invasion, King Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 20 verse 3 called the whole nation of Judah to fast about this. Then Jehoshaphat was afraid, set his face to seek the Lord, and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. All Jews were called to fast in Nehemiah 9 verse 1, Esther 4:16, and the king of Nineveh proclaimed a fast for all his people in response to the preaching of Jonah in Jonah chapter 3 verses 5 through 8. And incidentally, in the early days of the United States, in those days in the colonies, Congress proclaimed 3 national fasts, and in the United States early days, Presidents John Adams and James Madison each called all Americans to fast, as Abraham Lincoln also did on at least 3 separate occasions during the American Civil War. Can you imagine what would happen today if our president called on all Americans to fast for one day? One of my all-time favorite presidential statements was made by President George H.W. Bush when it was noticed that at a state dinner he didn't eat his broccoli. And later he said, you know what? When I was a kid, I didn't like broccoli, and now I'm President of the United States, and I don't have to eat my broccoli if I don't want to. But the broccoli producers of America went up in arms against that, fearful that the statements of the president would harm the broccoli industry. And the president had to make a public apology and encourage people and encourage children to eat their broccoli. Can you imagine what would happen in a nation where 1 out of 10 Americans eats at McDonald's every day if the president said, not only don't eat your broccoli, don't eat anything for one entire day? I mean, it's inconceivable that regardless of the purpose, being called on to participate in a national fast today. And that's a shame. Then we speak of the categories of first a regular fast. In the Old Testament, there was one there, perhaps you know what that is, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Each year, every Jew was to fast then, that's Leviticus 16. While they were in Babylon, the leaders of the Jews instituted 4 other annual fasts, according to Zechariah 8:19. And the Pharisee, in Luke 18:12, congratulates himself in prayer for keeping the tradition of the Pharisees by saying, I fast twice a week. And though he had no biblical warrant to do so, it's well known that John Wesley would not ordain a man to the Methodist ministry who would not fast every Wednesday and Friday. And I sometimes shudder to think what it might do to the enrollment of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary if we, well, let's move on. So there's also an occasional fast mentioned in the Bible. These occur on special occasions as the need arises. This is what happened when Jehoshaphat proclaimed the fast throughout all Judah. It was on the occasion of the invasion. This is what Esther did when she was about to go into the Oval Office unannounced. You don't do that. They have to shoot first and ask questions later. She was going to go in before the king, and unless the king symbolized his acceptance and extended the scepter toward the person, if someone came in unexpectedly, the guards had to kill that person because they had to presume you were there for nefarious purposes when you barge into the Oval Office without letting anybody know that you are coming. And so on the occasion of going in to intercede for her people before the king, she had this congregational fast that was called. All the Jews in Susa were supposed to fast for her. And so on the occasion of that, she called for a fast. And this is the kind of fast implied by Jesus in Matthew 9:15 when he said, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. So it was on the occasion of the bridegroom being absent that this fast would occur. So if you were to pick one from each of these categories, the most common fast today would probably fall, the first one would be normal, then in the second group, private, and then occasional. So most of the time when people fast today, it's something they do individually. It's not one that's called by the church, which is great. We should have more of those, but the most common kind of fast would be one that someone does on their own. therefore is private, and it's a normal fast in the sense that I should have started there. It's a normal fast in the sense that they don't eat, but they would drink water, have coffee, juice, something like that, and they would do this alone, on their own, and on a specific occasion, because they're praying about something, they're concerned about something, and it's not an ongoing, regular activity. It's just because of a certain occasion, on their own, they decide to fast, and they would fast by means of not eating, but they would drink water or coffee or something like that. So that is an introduction, an explanation of fasting and the kinds of fasting. As we come to the next section, we will look at how fasting is expected by Jesus of His followers.